I want to begin by thanking Sandy and David and Shannon for their hospitality and their logistical support. I've wanted to attend the Summer Institute for a long time, and I'm delighted to finally be here and to participate in all this wonderful and stimulating discourse. Yeah, as David said, my topic has a distinctly anti-liberal flavor, but in fact it kind of meshes a little bit with Alberto's paper. It meshes with what we heard about Lerner and Trotsky the other day, and it meshes even with George DiMartino's paper, where he discussed a lot about welfare economics and the compensation principle. So that's, there are little points of tangency with other things that we've heard. So, Franco Modigliani. Of course, he is best known, he is well known as one of the architects of the post-war Keynesian neoclassical synthesis. We all know and have read his path-breaking 1944 paper on liquidity preference and the theory of interest in money. That paper was, in fact, his doctoral thesis at the New School for Social Research. It was written under the supervision of Jacob Marshak and Abel Lerner. And, of course, we know it was a first-rate analytical performance. He knocked it out of the park. Very impressive achievement for a newly minted PhD. Just when he wrote it, he was barely 25 years old. We can all only dream of having a doctoral dissertation that produces something like that. And then, of course, he went on to create an enormous body of work that rightly earned him the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. I want to talk about his next project, the one he moved on to right after finishing the 1944 paper. And that was a very large work on the organization and management of production in a socialist economy. This paper is little known. It was written and published in Italian. He never published an English version. It is, in fact, the only major work of his that is not included in the 5-volume MIT edition of his scientific writings. He deliberately left it out. He appears never to have referred to it again until the publication of his autobiography a couple of years before he died. He began work on it soon after finishing his PhD. It was like he went right into it. And the article was completed sometime during 1945, and then he was thinking a little bit about when and where and how to get it published, and in the end it appeared in 1947. It's a very substantial paper. It's very long. It's 75 printed pages in Italian. And my English translation of it comes to over 30,000 words. So it's a little monograph, in fact. So let me say up front what it does. It argues the case for socialism along the lines laid out earlier by Oskar Lange and Abel Lerner. Their influence is all over it. Their fingerprints are all over this paper. It is intended to be a practical guide for implementing a socialist program that could actually work. And the key, Modigliani argues, is for the planners to make full use of the coordinating properties of the price mechanism. Now, in his autobiography, Modigliani distances himself from the 1947 paper. He treats it as, like a youthful indiscretion. He describes it, here I'm quoting, he describes it as an exercise in forcing myself to imagine how production was run efficiently in a socialist economy and how it handled the absence of a market so as to achieve the desired results. So it's a thought experiment. I'm just playing around. But this is a misrepresentation of the article, and I think it's a little bit disingenuous, if truth be told. At the very start of the 1947 paper, Modigliani says right out that his analysis will show, and now I'm quoting again, his analysis will show that a socialist system is not only economically possible, but also that such a system would tend to function much better than the system of private enterprise. All right, so it's a very forceful position that he's taken. And in retrospect, right, in his autobiography, he thinks, well, maybe he was unduly influenced by his friendship with the Italian physicist Bruno Pontecorvo. They became friends in the late 1930s. He was a committed socialist, and eventually he defected, but now there's a hypothesis that maybe he was kidnapped to the Soviet Union. And Modigliani says, well, you know, maybe my friendship with him created a soft spot for socialism in me. But I think these rationalizations are a clear case of the economist don't protest too much. You know, when he wrote this paper, he was fully on board with the idea of transitioning to socialism. He was advocating it as something that he thought ought to be done. He may have moved past this phase in his thinking very quickly after that, but when he was writing the paper, for about a 2 or 3 year period, he was fully committed to it. It was not just a thought experiment. The paper is not a secret. It's, you know, there's no secret about its existence, even though not too many people know about it. Modigliani mentions it in his autobiography. It routinely appears on lists of his published work. But it has received no sustained attention, which I think is striking when you consider Modigliani's prominence, when you consider the fact that he is not at all associated with the socialist calculation debates, and when you consider how strongly sympathetic the paper is to socialism. I think the paper is also interesting because it was, in effect, the last significant contribution to the classic market socialist tradition by a major neoclassical economist. The paper is splendidly written. I do a little bit of translation. I've done a little bit of translation over the years, and this was a beautiful thing to work with because it is crystal clear. It could be a textbook on market socialism. It is so beautifully written. But it's not strikingly original on the theoretical side. Where I think the originality comes in is when he talks about the institutional detail that he applies to the problem. He goes into a lot more detail, I think, than Lange or Lerner does. There are very few references to the literature in it. There's an opening footnote where he talks about where he positions the argument in terms of the work of Lange, Lerner, Pigou, Dickinson. He doesn't mention Marx at all. And then he goes right into the argument, and then throughout the rest of the 70 or so pages that remain, there are no footnotes, there are no citations until the very end where he cites Lange. So, let's start with a little background. Modigliani was born in 1918. He emigrated from Italy in 1938 when the fascist regime implemented a set of racial laws. He spent some time in France, and then he came to New York to pursue graduate studies in economics at the New School for Social Research. His 1944 econometric article, we said, was his doctoral dissertation. Here's a picture of Franco Modigliani standing outside the New School. If you look up there, he's outside the 12th Street building. It's one of my favorite pictures of an economist. And here's a picture of Modigliani working with Hans Neisser. This is a few years later. Okay. So let me talk about the New School. The University in Exile, many of you know the basic background, was founded in 1933 as a haven for European economists and social scientists who were threatened with persecution and dismissal from the fascist governments of Germany and Italy. And the backbone of the graduate faculty were basically German-speaking economists. There were a few other social scientists, I'll mention a few of them in a minute, but the backbone were the economists. Emil Lederer, Edward Hyman, Jacob Marshak, Frieda Wunderlich, Gerhard Kohlm, and a little bit later on, Hans Neisser, Abba Lerner, and Adolf Loh. There were two Italians on the faculty early on. One was Max Ascoli, who was a political scientist who actually helped Modigliani to get a a scholarship at the New School, and Gaetano Salvemini, the historian. Salvemini left even before Modigliani arrived, but Modigliani became very close to him. I'm not sure how close he was to Ascoli. Ascoli, it's interesting that Salvemini left fairly quickly. Ascoli always felt a little bit out of place among all of the Germans. There's a letter from Ascoli to, I think it's Rafa, where he says, you know, these Germans, they just want to get on with their work as though nothing had happened, you know. I don't understand it at all. And he gives the sense of feeling always a little bit out of place among them. I might mention just in passing that Hayek was offered a position at the New School when there was a slight possibility of Hayek being interned as an enemy alien in England. The New School made an offer to him. In the end, it was not necessary because he was not interned, but that's a little bit of trivia that might be interesting to people in this room. So, we also, most of us I suppose know that the focus of the faculty was strongly interdisciplinary. There was something called the General Seminar in which all of the disciplines participated. The economists were not particularly hostile towards neoclassical economics. What they were doing was, I think, pushing that envelope of neoclassical economics, the tools, in directions that it was generally not pressed. You know, they were virtuosos in the use of these tools, and they were always thinking outside the box. And I always like to talk about this because, you know, I'm a Sraffian, I'm a Marxist, I'm a post-Keynesian, so I'm not that sympathetic to neoclassical economics. But, you know, I always have to tell my pals that, you know, there was a time when neoclassical economics was a progressive research agenda doing really outstanding stuff, and particularly the stuff that was being done in Italy from around 1890 to 1920s is, I find it impressive, even as someone who disagrees strongly with it. Ideologically, they were social democrats. They were sympathetic to the idea of planning. Many of them had worked in planning ministries prior to emigration. And they were committed to the idea that a well-managed state could create conditions for improved, broad-based socioeconomic well-being. And then, of course, fascism taught them a very painful lesson about the state's capacity to abuse its power. So now I will stick to the slides. And I think this is I have just enough slides to take up about 45 minutes. There are only about 35 or so slides. I know it's a pathetically small number compared to people who have occupied this podium before me, but I should get through all of them on time, in good time. So, and now I can take off my reading glasses, too. So, by the late 1940s, Keynesianism and the Cold War had taken market socialism off the table. I don't think that's quite accurate. Maybe it would be more accurate to say it had taken some of the wind out of the sails of market socialism as a topic of interest for economists. It had, of course, been thoroughly hashed out before the outbreak of the war, which is one of the reasons why, you know, there's not much left for Modigliani to say about it. And the other thing is that Keynesianism meant that the most damaging aspect of the market system, the fact that it can't ensure acceptable levels of employment, that now had an effective and relatively simple remedy. Okay. Now, even as I say this, I realize that the brain synapses of about 85% of the people in this room are in a state of rapid-fire excitement, wanting to tell me the countless ways in which this statement is wrong. Okay, so I can only ask you to indulge me on that. Okay. And then the other thing was that there were these post-war tensions with the Soviet Union that created a political climate where any kind of non-condemnatory discussion of socialism was not a good thing for your career. But Modigliani bucked the trend. He thought the topic deserved another look. And this is the article that he published. This is the title in Italian. This is, well, let me say something else. Even before he emigrated, you see in Modigliani this idea that the state has an obligation and, in a sense, a duty and a right to intervene in the market. He has a clear skepticism towards orthodox liberalism. In one of these papers, he makes a practical and moral case for interventionism. In this case, he's talking about price controls. And these two quotes are taken from that, I think, 1937 article, where he says, self-interest, individual self-interest can't manage the country's affairs in the manner most useful to the collectivity. There's a need for the state to control this egoism by limiting and preventing it when, as is always the case in practice, it amounts to the oppression of the weakest by the strongest. And when I say, in retrospect, politically naive, this screen, this passage makes me a little uncomfortable because once he figured out what fascism was about, he was fiercely opposed to it. But he didn't see right away what it was about. And I think when he's writing well, of course, he's only 20 years old, he's a kid, right? But he's still a little bit under that spell of corporatism, thinking, hey, why not? This can work. This can make life better for many, many people. Once he became friends with Salvemini, that's over, right? Then he's a fierce, fierce opponent of fascism. So this is how the article is organized. It's got 6 parts. And what I'm going to do is basically do a quick walk through those different parts. Okay, the approach to the problem, concrete task of the socialist entrepreneur. I think it's kind of interesting that he uses that word, entrepreneur. The distribution of income, problems of finance, other problems, and the problem of transition. He says it's published, part of a larger unpublished work. But no trace of that larger work can be found in his papers, which is kind of unfortunate. Although in some correspondence he tells us at least part of what he cut out. He cut out a section just for the sake of keeping it tractable, right? It was published at 75 pages, so he had to cut it a little bit. An attempt to establish a set of accounts for the Italian socialist state on the basis of conditions prevailing. I guess in the last time there was any good data, So the approach to the problem. The basic conceptual framework is standard welfare economics. He's drawing very heavily. I see the influence of Oscar Lange's 2 papers most clearly. Lerner is in it, of course, but you see the parallels with Lange's argument particularly clearly. But he goes far beyond Lange and Lerner in discussing the design of institutions. And he starts with some basic welfare economics. He distinguishes between 2 kinds of decisions in economics. He calls them type A and type B decisions. So type A decisions are ones where there's at least one of available options involves an unambiguous Pareto improvement. And he says, well, in those cases, duh, it's easy, right? We make that change. We go for the Pareto improvement. Type B choices are trickier because they involve situations where every single one of the alternatives involves making some groups better off at the expense of other groups. And he says, of course, he uses a very strange terminology. He calls these kinds of choices economically neutral. And by that, he means really there's no clear-cut economic criterion that we can apply. You have to bring in extra economic criteria, moral, political, etc. Type A decisions are very rare. Almost all changes that take place in the economy involve some harm to some members of the collectivity. But then the possibility of compensating the injured parties can enlarge the class of type A decisions significantly. And then, here's where his innate practicality kicks in, right? He talks about when should you make a change, and under what circumstances should you make compensation? And he says, well, let's see. Since people have an interest or derive welfare from not having their lives turned upside down, in effect, he says, if the net gains are small, you probably shouldn't make the change. You shouldn't inflict harm on people. If the net gains are large, then make the change, but then make the compensation, right? So he's in a sense he doesn't cite Caldor or he does cite Hicks, but he answers that question of whether we should make compensation or not. So he does it just very elegantly in just this throwaway statement. I think that's kind of neat. So what's he trying to do? He wants to develop a set of practical rules that the managers of socialist enterprises can follow to ensure efficient outcomes. Right? So in a market economy, the managers must follow a simple rule, right? Maximize profits. Do what you have to do to maximize profits. And what he wants to do is come up with a comparably simple set of rules to guide the management of socialist firms. And his starting premise is, as I said at the beginning, you have to make use of the price system. Prices furnish the only objective criterion for evaluating the economic needs of the collectivity and for determining the most efficient way to satisfy them. And then from this premise, from the starting premise, he derives 4 fundamental rules. Individuals have to be allowed to spend their incomes as they wish. Prices have to be free to adjust to bring quantity demanded into line with the quantity available. People have to be free to choose their own occupations. He's very adamant about that. And you can see that there's a real non-coercive bias to his approach to all of this. Techniques of production have to be selected with a view of minimizing the cost of production, and output should be set at the level that makes price equal to marginal cost. Okay? And then he says, well, the only circumstances in which the third and fourth of these conditions hold is perfect competition. And basically what he means by perfect competition is a situation where the individual enterprise can't affect price, so it's absence of market power. When the market, again, practicality, when the market generates good outcomes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, there's no need for intervention. But when firms operate outside the conditions of perfect competition, then he says there's a compelling case that they should be socialized and managed for the collective good. Here's the one passage from the 1947 paper that he quotes in his autobiography. The usual widely repeated phrases such as production for consumption and not for profit, the firm must be run for the general interest, they're completely devoid of meaning when they're not backed up by concrete, objective, and verifiable rules. The capitalist system functions, albeit with many inefficiencies, because those who direct the firm have a precise task to perform to maximize the firm's profits. If the socialist state, after having socialized its enterprises, offers to the firm's directors only a vague ethical principle to guide their actions, the economic machine will either function in an arbitrary way or it won't function at all. It is the merit of economic theory to have shown how these nebulous slogans, the slogans in quotation marks, can be translated into concrete principles and rules of action. And it seems to me that the reason that he quotes this in his autobiography is because he wants to reinforce He knows this is on his list of publications. He wants to reinforce the idea that he's not a naive, romantic idealist. He's a hard-headed economist. So what are the function of prices? Well, in a market economy, prices have two functions. They have an allocative function to ensure efficiency in the allocation of resources. And they have a distributive function, which is to determine the incomes of the members of society. He treats them as though they're distinct functions. He doesn't pay enough attention to the fact that these two functions are interwoven with each other. They can't really be totally separated. But what he argues is that in socialized economies, the allocative function would be fully performed by the price system. In that sense, the prices perform the same function that they do in a market economy, but in a socialist economy, the distributive function would be radically diminished. Right? It would still have some distributive function, but it would be curtailed, and we'll see how in a few minutes. Decisions about the level at which to operate existing plant and equipment should strictly follow the P = MC rule. And then he says profits and losses are irrelevant to this decision if the aim of production is to maximize social welfare. Right? Other market socialists said they added another condition that the firm at least has to break even. And Modigliani has a fairly interesting argument where he says, no, in fact, that's not the case at all. If a firm is making losses, that's completely irrelevant to the aim of maximizing social welfare. Bygones are right? He follows through on the bygones are bygones argument in a logical way. Once the plant is set up, then firms should operate at this P = MC level of output. Where covering costs matter is in the long-term decisions about the size of productive capacity. There you need to take into account whether over the long run costs will be covered by revenues. Well, let me mention this, because I know there are some people in the room who are interested in post-Keynesian economics. He has a numerical example where he has a very interesting kind of cost curve. It's kind of like a Koletskian cost curve with a horizontal bit, but it's not just horizontal. There's a step function. It's like a step function. So over some range of output, the marginal cost is constant. Then you need then you enter into a higher level of cost until you reach full capacity, and then it becomes vertical. So I thought that was interesting. It's not the usual neoclassical cost curve that he imagines. What about the interest rate? The state sets the interest rate, and this rate will affect the investment decisions of the directors of the firms. It will affect the cost of credit to individuals and privatized firms, and it will also affect the return on private savings. But he doesn't say much about the criteria that the planning authorities should adopt when they set the interest rate. And here he kind of differs a little bit from Lange. Lange argues that it should be set with a view to the level of investment, the growth rate that the state wants to push. And Lange is very forthright about this. He says, this may involve a welfare cost if the growth rate that the state wants differs from the amount of saving that individuals want to do. And then he says, well, okay, there's a welfare loss, but he says this is really a small cost relative to the larger set of benefits that emerge from socialism. So. Now, here's where the paper becomes pretty interesting, I think. Modigliani's paper becomes interesting because he addresses this issue that sometimes comes up. Well, one of the neat things about capitalism is that it generates innovation, it generates new products, it generates progress, qualitative as well as quantitative progress. In a capitalist system, there appear hundreds of new articles, different kinds of goods. Old products undergo continual variations in design and improvement. It's necessary, therefore, we need a way for the socialist economic system to have a mechanism that will introduce innovations, that will promote innovation the same way that capitalism does. Because without that, the life of the socialist economy, it's the one point in the article where it becomes a little bit poetic. The life of the socialist economy would tend to ossify and to become as monotonous as life in a barracks. So we don't want that. And then he talks about the difference between how capitalism resolves this issue. Capitalism resolves this issue because there's a profit motive. You introduce a successful innovation and you make money hand over fist. That's the prospect of that is what generates innovation. In a socialist system, we see instead an oscillation between two opposite and equally grave dangers. On the one hand, there's the danger that because there isn't a profit motive, the managers will not have any incentive to innovate. And on the other hand, there's the danger that since they're taking risks with other people's monies, all right, there's no penalty, in a sense, for wasting the resources of the community, that they'll be a little bit reckless. And then he makes a judgment call. He says, well, you know, if we look at what we know about human nature and modern day bureaucracies, probably the first danger, the danger of inertia, is the more serious one, the one we really have to worry about. So stasis and routine are really he says the only true danger of a socialist economic system. He may be overstating the case, but that's the starting point. So he has a solution for this, right? He says we should set up research commissions for each branch of industry, and they'll be charged with the task of promoting innovation, right? He says that there should be a system of bonus pay that would reward innovations that pay off, that prove successful. Decisions, the ultimate decisions about new investments would be taken by the research commissions in collaboration with a central commission for the coordination of investment. All right? The latter entity, this central commission, would coordinate the investment plans of the different research commissions. It would also, this is the entity that sets the interest rate. And it should be mindful of the consistency between the amount of investment that the research commissions want to initiate and the amount of liquid capital that's being generated by the economy through depreciation and by private savings.
That's NGDP targeting, right?
Yeah. Okay, and he makes another point about this. He says, you know, socialism has a particular advantage over private enterprise as regards investment. Neither private firms nor socialized firms, he's upfront about this, they can't know whether any particular investment project will pay off. But private firms face an economic risk that socialist firms don't face. The risk from more or less absolute ignorance of the plans of other entrepreneurs as well as, right? So there's always this question of what the demand is going to be for any product. But in addition to that, the socialist firm doesn't, the capitalist firm doesn't know what its competitors are planning to do. Right, so it's a game theory kind of problem. That problem doesn't necessarily arise in a socialist economy. A socialist economy can obviate that because the public actions of every firm will be public knowledge, right, through the commission, the central commission. What about the distribution of income? Well, that's section 3. It says that the distribution of income always involves both type A and type B decisions. And the type A aspect has to do with channeling resources into their most efficient uses. You know, higher wages may be necessary to induce people to do risky or unpleasant work. Some income differentials compensate for the training necessary to enter certain professions, like being a doctor or an engineer. And he deals with this by saying Well, why don't we just take steps to ensure equality of opportunity to all who show an aptitude for these professions, right? Now those professions are blocked by the fact that if you don't come from a rich household, you can't get into them. Access should be contingent on ability, not on the income of one's family. So education is something that is publicly provided, including specialized professional education. He says that maybe less qualified people shouldn't be barred from these professions, but then they should have to pay tuition. And then the tuition could be channeled back into the education system, or it could be allocated to the community as part of the social dividend. Now, maybe here's a good place to stop and say, it is very clear he has a lot of confidence in the technocrats. There's no doubt about that. And it's kind of, again, he was not 20, but he was just about 30 when he wrote this stuff. So this is the kind of thing you might go in this direction when you're a young man, when you're a little bit older, and you see how bureaucracies really work. You're not so confident about all of this. He talks a little bit about, what are the incentives for the managers to perform competently? And here he has an interesting argument. He says that, in modern private enterprise, the managers are not owners of the firms either. There's separation of owner. So what causes them to perform well? They're interested in having good careers. Their movement up the career hierarchy depends upon competent performance. There's no reason why it should be any different in a socialized economy. Right? He talks about wage differentials arising because workers aren't comfortable moving to places where there's demand for their skills. And he says, well, okay, that's not a big deal either. We can have a program for subsidizing relocations and make it easier for people to do that if they have to. But he says, when there is no objective economic rationale for an income differential, then income should be as equal as practicable. So he has a clear bias in favor of equality of income. Right? So this is a quote from the 1947 paper. Between two distributions of income whose effect on collective welfare is not objectively measurable, in the sense described above, the one that leads to less economic inequality is to be preferred. So he's upfront about this. This is a bias. This is a subjective bias on my part, but this is what I think should be the direction of the change. And then he says, therefore, any surplus revenues that the socialized firms earn over cost will be allocated to households as a collective dividend, an equal payment per capita. And here he differs a little bit from Lange, because Lange thinks that, the pay differentials of different kinds of workers are prices that are part of the efficiency signals. So what Lange says is that the distribution of the social dividend should be proportional to the pay, as opposed to per capita. And Modigliani also says, if we notice that the market assigns to an individual a wage in excess of what would be necessary to induce him to perform a particular kind of work, the excess wages may be subject to taxation, and the tax revenues then get paid out as part of the the social dividend, right? So it would be, I'm sure there are certain bankers who are making, $14 or $15 million a year. They'd probably be willing to do that. They'd probably be willing to show up and do their jobs pretty competently for considerably less than that. I always tell my students who sometimes are hostile towards redistribution, and they talk about how CEOs are getting what they deserve, what they earn. You have to pay them that, or they won't be as productive. I just say to them, what kind of a lazy bastard needs a 7-figure salary to show up and do his job? But anyway, that's my ideological bias, I think. All right, problems of finance. Well, I need to move a little bit more quickly. He's in favor of allowing private saving and the accumulation of wealth resulting from it, right? So he would not ban the accumulation of private wealth. Why not? Well, he surmises that saving will be lower in a socialist economy than under private enterprise systems because economic life is less precarious, right? People don't need to save as much for a rainy day and personal disaster and so forth. And saving, because it's necessary to finance growth, right? He's still got a neoclassical outlook. Because it's necessary for growth and because it involves a sacrifice, it shouldn't be penalized. So again, this reflects his bias against coercion. He also says, well, there's a strong economic argument to ban inheritance and large gifts, but knowing what we know about human nature, maybe it's best not to ban it, but just to limit it, to regulate it. Because if you try and ban it, then you'll have massive efforts for people to just evade the law. So let's be practical about this. He advocates the management of the state budget and taxation right, so here's a Keynesian dimension to the argument, to compensate fluctuations in demand due to hoarding because people save. And he favors progressive taxation, but he's also mindful of the possible distortive incentive effects. There's a section on problems relating to the implementation of a socialist economic system. This is a catch-all system, and here I'll only mention what I thought was the most interesting part, where he talks about the role of labor unions. They don't become obsolete under socialism because, even though the wage is set by the market, according to the principles that he describes, right? A lot goes on in the interaction between employer and workers that needs to be mediated, right? All kinds of disputes arise, and workers need representation. The unions also serve a role in the cultural life of workers, and he talks that. For some reason, he's quite interested in them providing athletic outlets, sports for the workers. What about the transition from a system of private enterprise to socialism? And here I'm coming to the end. He starts this section with a statement that's a little bit like what Marx and Engels say in the Communist Manifesto about the dynamism of capitalism and how it has generated tremendous amounts of wealth. And we shouldn't deny that. We need to acknowledge that. That's important. But he says the system is no longer capable of absorbing the enormous savings it is capable of generating, right? So there's a Keynesian argument there. And then he presents an even more damning argument, which is very interesting to me. He says the capitalist class has lost the capacity, the boldness, and the will to take on new risks. And this is because it is too focused on the defense of monopoly positions already acquired, as well as because the political, ethical, and social climate is becoming ever more hostile to large-scale financial and industrial capitalism. It is precisely because of this last reason that the unemployment problem admits of temporary palliatives, but probably not permanent solutions under capitalism. For all the concrete measures for eliminating and controlling unemployment, whether they aim at income redistribution or investment on the part of the state, necessarily end by interfering with private decisions and private profits, further diminishing the courage and the willingness to take on new risks. So this is why he thinks Keynesianism isn't enough, because you need socialism, because capitalism has lost the dynamism that made it so successful. So he concludes that a policy of socialization, as described in the preceding 70 pages, ought to be initiated. But he is no Fabian, right? As much as he's saying, well, you know, we have to take cautious steps, we have to always be willing to rethink a move. On the question of the transition, he says the shift should be made all in one stroke. A failure of courage can only generate first economic chaos and then counter-revolution. And there's this long quote where he lays out the rationale, and I'll give you a second to look at it. Again, practicality. For this to work, property relations should be disturbed only once, at one stroke, and that the property rights that are not abrogated be reinforced and protected. Okay? It's necessary to make clear from the start that the move towards socialization is not opposed to private property per se, but only when it is incompatible with the interests of the majority. So from the practical point of view, this means that the firms and the property that are destined to become social property must be socialized in a single stroke. And then he closes the paper with a quote which reflects this from Oscar Lange. There exists only one economic policy which the economists can commend to a socialist government as likely to lead to success, and this is a policy of revolutionary courage. And that's the end.
Well, this is just wonderful fun. There's all sorts of questions that just jump out at one, and you know, let me lead off by one. And this sort of this economically neutral business, is that sort of like the social indifference curves, when you've got the possibility of cycling compensation, but you know, the Stokowski move is to make those guys socially indifferent, which comes out in Sandler, so kind of stuff. And so, is that picking up that counter-Hicks reversion?
I don't think so. I don't think he's thinking in terms of a social indifference curve. I think what he means the term to refer to issues that cannot be resolved by a straightforward, deterministic economic criteria, and you need to introduce some kind of value judgment.
I'm doing my Vanna White bit.
Thanks a lot, Gary. I really enjoyed that. I've just got a short question, which is concerns your point that Modigliani says that you should choose the level of output according to the price equals marginal cost rule, and you should pursue that really strictly, with profit and loss being irrelevant for production decisions. Did that mean that he wouldn't have adhered to the short-run shutdown rule? So if price was less than average variable cost, he still would have said, carry on regardless?
Yes. Yes, he would have done that.
On what grounds would that have been? Because it would seem to me that that would imply a loss of current resources.
Well, the argument is simply that if the marginal cost measures the value of what society has to give up to get an extra unit of the good, the price measures what society values by having another unit of the good. So long as one is greater than the other, you should produce more units, even if that involves the loss cutting into your fixed cost. The only time the profit-loss criterion enters into the argument for him is when you're talking about long-run decisions, right? So in that case, right, that you just described, what that means is that something has changed which invalidated an earlier investment decision. But you know, that capacity is still there, and now the issue is how do we use that capacity so as to maximize social welfare? As long as price is greater than marginal cost, produce more of the good. It's a very simple idea.
This is just an elaboration of this. I forget the date. What's the date for this?
1947.
So is there any reference to hoteling?
No.
It's
No, it
fascinating.
is not it doesn't contain a lot of citations. There's just that list at the beginning, and then he goes through it like as though it were an instruction manual. You know?
It's fascinating because you see, this, as soon as you bring in convexity and you allow inaction, then you rule out this problem of prices, of there being losses with marginal cost pricing. So marginal cost pricing is essentially tied to increasing returns to scale, where the state must come in to make up for the losses. And so it's essentially tied to non-convexities. And he's just silent as general equilibrium theory develops with this convexity assumption. And then general equilibrium theory takes a turn towards non-convex marginal cost pricing. And on that also it's silent. So it's all, and then you are saying he never reprinted in this in his, so it's just fascinating. It's just fascinating. It's as if someone is saying, oh no, that was a wrong turn. I don't want to go there anymore.
That might be. I really don't know whether he was familiar with Hoteling's argument or not, or paid much attention to it. What I can suggest is that what he wanted, he explicitly wanted a user's manual for the socialist manager, right? So getting into those subtle theoretical issues, that was not what he was trying to do with this.
Thanks. This is a wonderful paper and really helpful to me in my own project, and just interesting anyways. The other day I talked about Jeffrey Sachs as having this orientation to advise clients to move quickly before any opposition could respond in order to get the job done that had to be done, that Jeffrey Sachs knew had to be done because he had the truth, and so on and so forth. And I said at the time that this isn't just, I didn't presume this is just a New Keynesian or a Chicago school problem, but that in fact it's shared widely among economists. And now you've finished with these lovely quotations that makes the point. And I just want to read, William Barber wrote a review of a book about Friedman in Chile. It appeared in the JEL, William Barber's review. And this is what William Barber had to say. And I think when I read this, I was struck by it, and now you've given me evidence that I'm going to steal for my work. Here, William Barber says this: economists operating within distinctly different analytical traditions have been willing to deploy their talents under conditions in which democratic processes were held in abeyance. The phenomenon on display here is thus not Chicago specific, but to borrow a Marshallian phrase, is a species of a larger genus. And the central characteristic of that genus is an attitudinal one, namely an absolute conviction in the validity of one's doctrinal position and an unquestioning faith that his teachings will uplift the human condition, end quote. And if you turn around and look what you've got there right behind you, it's about the need for revolutionary courage. It just seems endemic to our profession that economists who want to improve the world have this notion about not just the right, the moral obligation to help decision makers get through the process quick before society that's going to be harmed, those members of society who are going to be harmed, can push back. It's just, for me, it's deeply disturbing, but it's just,
yeah, I don't know that it's just economists. I think it's human nature. It's hard for me to get to because I always think I'm wrong about everything. I'm always beset with self-doubt. But again, it's partly a manifestation of the fact that he was a very young man when he wrote this article. And the other thing is that we are human beings. We are a problem-solving species, right? We see something wrong, we want to fix it, And then you combine that with specialized knowledge and training, right? You are a member of a class, an advisory class. It's a social class, right? And the temptation to just want to say, yeah, I know how to do this. I know how to fix this, is there. Now, once it started, and again, this is, the ending of this paper to me is a little bit jarring because it's so different from what we know about Modigliani's temperament in all other issues. It's always, okay, here's what I think, but when you want to apply this in a real world situation, then you have to be a little careful and so on and so forth. I remember older members of IRPI always used to tell me, Modigliani, we could always talk to him, we could always deal with him. He was always open-minded. You know, so I think partly this is a byproduct of the fact that he was young. And I would say one other thing. I presented this, a very, very primitive version of this many years ago at a conference, and Charles Goodhart happened to be in the audience. And he suggested to me that, you know, maybe one of the things that was on Modigliani's mind was that he was thinking about returning to Italy. And at around this time, it looked like the left had a good chance of coming to power. And it may have been that he took a stronger position than he otherwise might have done, or expressed himself much more forcefully for that reason. You know, I find that plausible, but I can't find anything in his papers that indicates one way or the other.
Just on that point, in your paper you say that he mentions, I guess in his autobiography, completing the essay by 45.
Yeah.
And you know, the official date is 47, but you know, one wonders whether the thing was written before the end of the war and how events may have, you know.
That could be. I only, you know, you have to wade through a lot of stuff in his papers. I don't know what happened to it between 1940. You know, he was trying to get it published. It got lost in the mail. He had to find it. Somebody sent it back to him. And then there was this issue of shortening it a little bit.
Yeah, Gary. This is supposed to be a user's manual, if I understand it. And there is some planning committee. Okay, so I'm a manager, and I'm supposed to implement marginal pricing, right? Tell me how I do that.
He is not explicit about it, but I think that there is implicit some kind of a trial and error mechanism, as in Langa, that you. Let me be the first one to say that I am not endorsing this. I'm a socialist, but this is not how I would go about making a better world. And that's precisely for the reason that I think is implicit in your question. You don't know what the demand curves look like. You can't even, or the cost curves, right? You construct that through a process of trying this, trying that, and seeing what works. So yeah, his argument would be the same way the market system, a private system, would work that out. You go through, right? It's the Langa argument, trial and error, but the criterion should be not maximizing profits, but setting price equal to marginal cost.
This is just a small follow-up to that. Was there any discussion of this paper? And particularly, I'm curious if Lange reflected on it and developed his own views further in any
Not
way.
that I know of. You know, I looked in Modigliani's correspondence, and there's no real discussion of it. I think there might be a mention of the work in a letter to Lerner, perhaps. Now, I know Lerner's papers are at the Library of Congress, and I looked at them years ago before I was on this project. So one of the things I'll do this summer is see if there's anything in Lerner's papers relating to this. But no, there was no discussion of it that I can find in Modigliani's archives. And there was no subsequent discussion of it in the literature. Now, again, he published it in 1947 in an Italian journal. Believe me, the Italians their minds were elsewhere, right, at this point. They had other things to deal with besides academic economics. So, you know, the article was published, but as far as I know, there was no subsequent reaction to it, even in the Italian literature. You know, you Google this piece, and you don't find anything except, you know, here's a list of Modigliani's publications, this is on it, you know. And then, you know, 2 old drafts of my paper. That's it. That's all you find. Which is, you know, every week I get these bulletins from that guy who's sending working papers in the history of economic thought. I open them with dread, thinking, okay, now finally I'm going to be scooped on this project, and it never happens. So I'm going to try and finish this summer before it does.
He was colleague of, you know, this whole group at Illinois, of which he was part, with Leo Hurwitz and so on, and they got a foul not directly with McCarthy, but with the representatives of McCarthy at Illinois and so on. Did this figure into that McCarthyite accusation?
It did not. There was, I think he had a letter from his dean where he was asked about his work, and he sent back a little bit of a, kind of an abrupt response about it. You're familiar with my work. When he was being considered for employment at the University of Chicago, the person he was corresponding with asked him about his earlier research and whether any of it touched on political issues that he ought to be aware of. And again, he wrote back to say, well, of course, I've not made a secret of my work. You have my resume, and this piece is on it. But no, there's no indication in his papers that he was rattled by McCarthyism. But I would also say it would be highly unusual if he did not sense which way the wind was blowing and realize that this was not the direction in which you ought to take his research if you wanted to have a career in the United States.
And I am told in the Chicago Library, Langer's 1940 article on the foundations of welfare economics had stamped on it that beware when you read this, because this man is a member of the Communist Party. So,
interesting. That's
those are
interesting.
difficult times.
Gary, since this is meant as a user manual, right? It reminded me of something which happened in the late 60s in East Germany within the centrally planned economy. They tried to decentralize the old system. So precisely to incentivize innovation and to basically have bottom-up processes. But what actually happened that it really became a mess, because you had the enterprises, you had all these ministries of the industry of XYZ, and you had the centrally planned board. So does he have an idea, because aluminium is used by tons of industries, for example, so how would this superstructure of centrally planned economy, ministries, and individual enterprises cooperate in the sense of incentives and in the sense of power? Because you really get power impasses which are probably insolvable.
Yeah, as I said when I was making the talk, that he has a lot of faith in the technocrats. And I think that his faith is misplaced. I think that he assumed that people would have an incentive to try and get things right and avoid the political conflict that would mess things up. But he also doesn't go into those internal issues. I think he thinks that the Central Commission, okay, can coordinate the plans of the individual research councils in a way that could avoid these problems. It's not clear to me how much he would allow the price system to assign values to different inputs. That he's a little bit murky about. Okay, I think in the end he would probably say, yeah, there has to be some pricing role to pricing capital goods and resources like aluminum and so forth. The only distribution variable that he would have the state set is the interest rate.
So I think you're right in doing the history to sort of focus on where Modigliani was at when he sort of wrote this. But as I was thinking about this, thinking about his subsequent career and then what was happening to economics, I think that maybe more needs to be said than what you said about, well, there was the Cold War and Keynesianism. And in terms of the economics profession, what occurs to me is that in the 50s and 60s, there was this growing field of comparative economic systems that was emerging. And then it also occurred to me that Schumpeter wrote his Capitalism and Socialism and Democracy, which went through, well, the first edition was 1942, but it went through 3 editions. think the third edition was in the early 1950s. So I think there's more to be said about interest in the profession and this ongoing. But what struck me, actually, I couldn't resist looking at Wikipedia about finding out more about Modigliani. One point you didn't happen to mention, it's in the Wikipedia article, is that when he fled from Italy, he went to Paris by way of his girlfriend's family. So you might want to put in a little bit about that, so that Abel Lerner behavior. But it did strike me the two big contributions that Wikipedia mentions are the Modigliani-Miller theorem and this whole issue about corporate finance is kind of where he got to in the 50s, and even working with Burton Miller, and some things would seem to have happened in the meantime. New School of Social Research and working with Burton Miller and efficient markets hypothesis, and then also, of course, the life cycle model of consumption and so on. So I think there's more of a story to be told than simply getting bored or about sort of changes in Modigliani's thinking between this article and then his subsequent career.
I always think there's a little tension in Modigliani between his practicality, his sensitivity to the importance of institutions, and his technical commitments, which are always to ground his arguments in some notion of rational optimization. I think that's always something that's interesting about him. He knows that the world is complicated and that human beings behave in complicated ways, and yet he always wants to reduce everything on some level to that kind of an argument.
Could it be that he wrote this precisely to bring the market socialist literature to the Italians, and that was the point of it, which might explain his later attitude toward it? And then another question, one more question. So some property was socialized, some was not. Did he have some kind of decision rule, some kind of criteria to decide whether you should socialize this industry or not?
Towards the end, he talks about that. When should you socialize? And his abstract rule is if you're outside of perfect competition, then a case can be made that the market is going to be non-optimal. But there's also this idea of look, again, the real world is complicated. There's certain small industries that may have some market power, but yet they are close enough. I don't think that he would socialize neighborhood restaurants. He doesn't talk about that, but I doubt that would meet the criteria in his practical application of it. On bringing the market socialism literature to the Italians, I would say I'm doubtful about that because the first market socialism article was Barone's 1908 article, so the Italians knew it, the Italian economists knew it. And in fact, the issue was raised by Pareto even earlier than that. And the other thing was that there was just a tremendous amount of fabulous marginalist literature from, up to 1930 that had really covered these kinds of issues pretty thoroughly.
We're running out of time, so I'll make this real quick. So we set the interest rate. Here, now in the West, we've had zero rates of interest for 6 or 8 years, which, according to Modigliani, would then say that the economy is not growing at all. And he wanted to set the interest rate to the growth, the idealized growth rate. And I was just wondering, how much different is that from Chicago school monetarism? Perhaps, I don't know enough to answer that. That's why I asked.
Well, I don't know enough to answer that either. I think he wanted to set the interest rate so as to counterbalance the investment plan that comes out of the collaboration between the research councils and the coordinating commission, to reconcile that with the amount of liquid capital that is voluntarily being generated by savers and through the depreciation of capital.
To alleviate the liquidity trap.
He doesn't think there would be a liquidity trap because he also says that the investment decisions should, right, the federal budget should counterbalance any hoarding. So the liquidity trap isn't an issue for him.
Can I just ask one last quick question? You identified yourself as a socialist, and so I'm wondering, is there anything in Modigliani that you find valuable when you think about the economy today, about the socialist project?
Here's what I would say to that. I would say that as someone who is a self-identified socialist, I'm really sorry that I think neoclassical economics is completely wrong. Because, what better argument is there for socialism than this? If this story was true, right? If the neoclassical story was true about how the world works and about how markets work, I think you have a perfect rationale for wanting to move in that direction. So, no, I find this interesting from the standpoint of the intellectual history of the 20th century. This is what's really of value in it. And I also find that the way he approaches things, the generosity of spirit with which he comes at problems, the open-mindedness, the attempt to counterbalance pure theory with practical concerns, that's something that I think we can all agree, whatever your ideological or scientific commitments, this is something that economists should pay attention to and be mindful of in the way they practice, right? The kind of stuff that you're interested in, right? How do we practice our discipline independently of our theoretical commitments?
So Eric has the last 3 words.
Grunberg, Modigliani, 1954. I think that's an important extension of the argument. So I want to argue that he may not have completely given up, because that's the paper called The Predictability of Social Events. And so it's another way of getting at how to think about this scientific advice that can actually get implemented. It's not in the socialist planning context, but I would suggest he didn't give up in time.
He's very interesting on uncertainty.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Okay,
Well,
thanks for that.
We are at, once again, an inequality constraint has clamped on. So, but I think this is just going to work.